So let's talk about our phenology calendar. And, let's see. So you're on your computer doing Zoom, but you probably have your phone close by. And so we're going to talk about how you can access this calendar if you've never used it before, what it means. Put this in your Google search bar. It doesn't have to be in the HTTP bar, but just in your search bar. Search for GDD, as in growing degree day. So GDD, and then a space, and then OSU. And this should be the first choice that comes up, the Ohio State Phenology Calendar. So what this calendar does, you put your zip code in. You can put a zip code anywhere in the state of Ohio. You have to be a Buckeye to do this. It defaults out to today's date, but you can put past dates in here. And then you say, show me the calendar. And what it does is drops you into the calendar. So I actually did this this afternoon for Mason. So I did 45040. For today's date, and it drops me onto this screen, and it shows me this is the GDD, or the growing degree day, which is a measure of accumulated heat. So what it's showing me is that here in Mason we have about 96 growing degree day units that have accumulated. So that's a heat measure, and what's on the left are things that have already happened. Code in Mason. Northern Lights forsythia, which is a cultivar of forsythia, should be blooming. Manchu cherries are blooming, and Eastern tent caterpillar, well, the webbing won't be this big, but those eggs have started to hatch out, right? It's going to be later that this webbing shows up, but right now what we would see is the eggs have hatched. And then what's to the right of this is those things that are about to happen. So speckled alder, these are actually the female portions of the fruits, but what we would see are the catkins, and I have a picture to show you. Cornelian cherry dogwood, I mentioned, full bloom, and then Norway maple, first bloom. So these things are about to come. So now if I click on view full calendar, it's going to drop me into this screen. Okay, so here I am in Mason on this day in the calendar, 96 growing degree days. And everything above that black bar is what has already happened or should have already happened. And what's below the black bar is what is about to happen. Okay. So this calendar was developed by Dr. Dan Herms, who's now the head of research at Davey Tree. He used to be at the OSU Department of Entomology. He was created what I like to think of as a big scroll. And so which plant activities were happening, which bloom activities, what bloomed now and what bloomed next and what bloomed after that, he put on this scroll along with these insect activities, and mostly insects of ornamental plants, so pests of ornamental plants, because that's what Dan's background is. And so he created this great long scroll that starts with the first bloom of silver maple, so pretty early in the season, for you all maybe early March, the first silver maple was in bloom, all the way through to Rose of Sharon. And if you're a gardener, that's kind of a, heat of the summer kind of plant. So this long scroll over 45 different insect species and close to 100 plant species. And so, as I said, anywhere you are in the state, you can put your zip code in. You get this list. So the plant instances on here, it's hard to tell with the screenshot, but they're in normal type, and the insects are in bold. It's a little clearer if it's in front of you on your phone. Maybe you can see that. And then you can click on any of these. If you're not sure what a larch case bear is or an exotic ambrosia beetle, you can click on those. Or you're not sure what one of the plants is, for example, the Sargent cherry. You can click on that, and you should get at least a picture of that. Sometimes you'll get a link to a fact sheet. Okay. So if I click on summary, so again, here I am in Mason, and we said we had 97 growing degree day. Let me tell you what the growing degree day unit means. So this 96 doesn't mean we've had 96 warm days, or there have been 96 warm days since January. What happens with the calendar is we zero out the growing degree day units in January. So we say there are 0 heat units that have accumulated on January 1. And for every day when we have an average daily temperature above 50 degrees, there's a formula that calculates how many heat units we've added that day. So if we have a very warm day, we may add 10 in spring. We may add 10 growing degree day units. If tomorrow it's another fairly warm day, maybe we accumulate 5 growing degree day units, but we add that to 10 from yesterday. And so it's a growing, an accumulated number. So I can click anywhere on the calendar, I can click on summary. So if you're like me, it's hard to remember, what last year was. Well, yeah, last year was, we don't want to remember last year at all, but it's hard to remember, was it a slow spring or a fast spring? I'm just not good at remembering from year to year. So if you click on summary, summary will give you the last 6 years in your zip code, and it'll compare how many growing degree day units had accumulated in those other years. Okay, so here we are this year at 96 units. Last year, we already had 164 growing degree day units that accumulated on this date last year. So we were a little bit further ahead last year, so it was a little warmer, or we had some warmer days that accumulated those units faster. 2019, we only had 81, pretty close, and you can see, 2017, we were at 189, so that one was, significantly faster than this spring. And 2015, slower or cooler with only 47 growing degree days. And so you can do that any date that you put into the calendar. You can click on that summary and just get a sense of how does this compare, to prior years. So, my arrow moved, but the arrow should be right here by the Buckeye State. I like to put this, I usually put the arrow a little closer in because, of course, as I said, this only works for zip codes in Ohio. But if you live close enough, right, you're just across the border or you're, here into West Virginia or Pennsylvania or what have you. I had someone, a beekeeper, email me, and he lived in Indianapolis, and he's like, I love this idea. And I'd like to be able to use the calendar, but I don't, what do I do? We don't have this in Indiana. And so I said, well, let's look here. If we find Indiana and we draw a line over, we can get a really close zip code in Ohio, and then you'll just follow their calendar and ground truth, right? So maybe, it turns out it's a little cooler in Ohio than in Indianapolis, maybe with the city. So just, wherever you fall into the scroll, kind of do some ground truthing and say, well, actually, you know what, I'm closer to here. My Chanticleer calorie pears are just coming into bloom, or Japanese pieris is in full bloom, or what have you. And you can kind of just adjust a little bit in the way you think about this calendar. So what's cool about the calendar is that the sequence is always the same. And once you get used to that idea, that's really the power of the phenology calendar, is that this sequence or this scroll that Dan helped to detail for us always stays the same. What changes from year to year is the pace at which we go through that sequence, right? So if it's a really warm spring, we have, maybe 80-degree temperatures next week. I don't think that's going to happen, but it could, right? And so we would go through that scroll much faster than if it turns back into 40-degree days. Things just kind of sit still, right, until it gets warm again. So an adaptable calendar that you can use across, kind of across the Midwest. Sometimes I give webinars for folks outside of Ohio, and there are ways that they can kind of transfer their regions into the Ohio calendar. And so we'll walk through the season a little bit and look at some of those plants that happen to be good pollinator plants. So I mentioned that this wasn't developed with pollinators or honeybees in mind. This calendar was developed to help people track and manage pests of ornamental plants. And so many of the plants they're all trees and shrubs, so they're all woody ornamentals. Many of them are native, some of them are non-native. And of course, many of the pests are non-native. And so you're not going to find, a list. This is not a list of which plants are great for honeybees, but many of them are really good pollinator plants and will help you kind of fill in the gap through the season. But let's first turn to how all bees nest and forage. Okay, so bees are what we call central place foragers. So your hive, wherever your hive is going, that's the central place, whether it's in your backyard or you have an apiary, maybe some acreage or your apiary's on a farm. That hive is the central place. So for this little bee that looks a little bit more like a bunny in here, just cute little bunny face, this little mason bee, this tube is the central place. Okay, so I think that's a male because males have yellow fuzzy mustaches. But if this were a female, or maybe this female that came out of this tunnel, that tunnel is the central place. That's where she's provisioning cells for her young. And she leaves that nest and forages out from there. Mason bees the females only go about 800 feet from that central place, so they can't forage very far. And they bring that food then back to that central place, right? So like all bees, it sort of depends how hungry the honeybees are. You know, how many resources are close by will really tell how far they're going to go. So if there are a lot of resources around you, there are a lot of flowers blooming, and they're offering what they need, pollen or nectar, they're going to go not very far from that central place. But if they need food, they can't find it. They're just like us. Remember when we used to go on road trips? We'd keep driving until we get the, whatever, the Panera on the interstate or something. We're going to go farther because we need food. We're going to keep going. So let's look at a really cool study that was done a couple years ago in Great Britain that really gives us a feel for that idea of central place foragers. This is using bumblebees. So you may have seen bumblebees that come in a box, like a paper box from Staples, and you can put them out in the field. Say you have blueberries or an orchard crop, apples or something. You can buy a bumblebee hive and put it out in the hive, and then usually those hives are destroyed at the end of the year, and you order new bumbles next year. So for this study, the researchers glued these little radar trackers to the abdomen of these bumblebees. So bumblebees, big and robust, the workers can take this extra weight on here. It's not a problem. And then they have a radar to monitor where are these bees going. So they take this paper box full of bumblebees. Some of the workers have the trackers on them. They put them out in the middle of the field. Okay, so the place where the nest went down is the blue dot here on the left. And these are 4 different individuals that were tracked. So if we look at this bee up here, for every bout or trip that worker bee took from that central place, from that hive, that was tracked on the radar. And the researchers coded that color according to whether they were the first trips, which are in green, the middle trips of that bee's life, or the final trips. And all these bees, they didn't come back for whatever reason. They died or they flew off. And we said before that a varied diet is the most important for honeybees, that they are the healthiest when they have lots of different kinds of flowers that they're visiting, bringing back lots of different pollen compositions, lots of those different secondary metabolites and vitamins and minerals that help to increase the hive health. So just want to really emphasize then the importance of trees and shrubs for that season-long bloom. Often when we think of, I want to put in some pollinator habitat, lots of people email me, and they might be thinking of a meadow, of a field of herbaceous perennials. But if we're not thinking about those trees, we're really missing a big chunk of the growing season. Because in Ohio, our native perennials really aren't doing a lot especially in sunny meadow situations. They're not really blooming until mid to late summer. It's our trees that are doing the lion's share of the work as far as providing pollen and nectar early in the season. So since you're in kind of a southern portion of the state, I wanted to refer to this bulletin in case you haven't seen it from the University of Kentucky, where they've done a lot of really great research. Dan Potter's lab looking at trees and shrubs that are bee friendly in that Ohio Valley region. And so of course Ohio is a pretty big state, and so some of the plants that grow well for you may not grow well in Ashtabula County or Lucas County and other corners of the state. So you may want to check out this bulletin. You can just put this in Woody Ornamentals and if you search for Dan Potter's lab, you're going to find some of their resources. And they've actually gone out and really monitored these plants for bee visitation. Not all the lists out there do that. So I think this is a really a nice piece of information for those of you from the southern stretches of the state. So let's walk through a little bit of the season. This is alder, and alders are blooming right now for me in Stark County. Probably you've seen them already this year. And so they produce these male catkins. This is where the pollen is produced, which really brings an interesting point about trees and bees. And so some of our trees that are wind pollinated, like alder, or I mentioned oaks earlier, ash are wind pollinated. So those wind pollinated plants, although they don't attract, they don't need bees to move their pollen around, right? They're wind pollinated. So they're putting all of these catkins out, and on breezy days, all that pollen is floating in the wind, giving us spring allergies, but easily taking that pollen to other portions of that plant that have the female flowers, right? And so bees aren't needed for pollination, but that doesn't mean that bees aren't visiting to gather pollen. Okay, so our maples, this is the male portion of the maple flower with all the pollen, but this is the female portion, so we can have nectar and pollen as a reward early in the season. And so here's a red maple, and again, we don't think of this as being a bee plant, but when there's nothing else blooming, the bees are definitely going to visit maples and bring that pollen back. This is the Cornelian cherry dogwood that I mentioned already. Here's the flowers. Here's the proof that the honeybees love this plant. If you have one in your yard or close by, and when that plant is blooming in late winter, you're going to see, it's warm enough for honeybees to visit. There's going to be honeybees all over that plant. All right, then we're up to willows. So we're just kind of walking through the season to see what blooms when. My pussy willows are in bloom right now. Yours may be a little past. Willows have separate male and female plants, and so obviously the male plants, the male flowers, very heavy in pollen, and the females are going to have more of that nectar reward. But lots of different bees are going to visit willows. They're really great native plants. Those farm fields that have that hint of pink on them, maybe that's happening right now for you. It's just starting up here. I noticed today on a drive at lunch. That's purple dead nettle primarily, although it's closely related to henbit. So remember the mint family, really great for bees. Again, if it's a warm enough day that your honeybees are flying, they're probably visiting purple dead nettle. I mentioned the cherries, and there are all kinds of cherries. So ornamental cherries or edible cherries, really easy for bees to visit, right? These open 5 petals, very accessible anthers, nectaries right in here. Here's a great big queen bumblebee. And if we just check into the calendar, right, so remember I said this is a great big scroll that started with the silver maple first bloom. And if I look here, we're at about 145 growing degree day heat units that have accumulated for that first bloom of the weeping Huygen cherry. Here's Serviceberry in bloom, so a great native tree. Here's a kind of a view of some of the habits. So a multi-stem tree. We have lots of different species in North America. There are also some horticultural varieties, some that are smaller, columnar, or tighter for different locations, but a great pollen and nectar plant. And I have to tell you why Serviceberry got its name. You may already know this story, but in the phenology world, this is the poster child of phenology because the association was historically when we lost folks during the winter. Our community had deaths, and we couldn't bury anyone in the cemetery. We couldn't dig the grave because we didn't have the ways in the old days. And so we had to kind of wait for the funeral service, and the way that we timed that was when the serviceberry was in bloom. So when the serviceberry is in bloom, that means the soil has thawed enough that we can dig the grave and hold the funeral service. So that's how serviceberry got its name. Okay, so we're still going through the season. So dandelions coming in bloom right around the time that mustards are in bloom. In fact, in this image, we have both of them. And sometimes these plants are called the spring yellows. Then we have redbuds in bloom. Lots of different bees will visit redbuds. Same with apples, and that's true whether it's crab apples or orchard apples. Really great nectar and pollen sources. Lots of different kinds of bees. There's actually a study out of Cornell. I think they identified something like 130 different kinds of bees, wild bees that came to apple orchards in New York State. So Dr. Reed Johnson is associated with the entomology department. He's a professor in our department, and you've probably seen Reed at the Southwest Beekeeper School or at other beekeeping events, or maybe you've seen him online here lately, but does some really great research about honeybees and what they're foraging on. And so did some research a few years ago where they used pollen traps to gather pollen from honeybees that were out in kind of the central and southwestern portions of the state. And then they analyzed what those pollen sources were. At that time, they were doing microscopic work with the pollen to figure out, they stain the pollen. It's not that color under the microscope, but they stain it so they can see the different characteristics and then figure out what species of plant that pollen comes from. And they sort out those pollen balls by color. There are sad undergraduate students who are employed to sort out all those pollen balls by color, and then they stain and analyze that pollen to figure out what plant it came from. Now they use something called DNA barcoding, where they can do some genetic analysis of all the pollen in that sample that the bees have collected. So they're really light years ahead with figuring out which plants all that pollen came from. But from this period, so if you remember a few years ago, we had some honeybee death because of corn dust. And so Dr. Johnson was really interested in what else is in bloom when corn is being planted. And so are honeybees visiting flowers that may have that pesticide dust on them because of the corn planting, and then they're bringing that back to the colony. And so he found that at the same time that corn was, he sampled over several weeks in late April and May of this particular year, and found that many of those plants were the dead nettle that I just mentioned, the dandelion, ash. So interestingly, that wind-borne pollen, but still a important food source. And hawthorns, which are in the apple family, really great resource for honeybees. And then he did this really cool graph here that shows, again, the time is down here from April through mid-May. And so if you take any slice here from this sample on May 2nd, we can see that a lot of the pollen was pink here. So that's from our rosaceous plants, that's our apples and our hawthorns. But some was also up here, dandelion and mustards, and then a lot of it here was orange, the ash, and some kind of declining, but still the maples. And so it just gives us this really interesting picture of how those floral resources change over time, right? So in early May, a few days after the very beginning of May, the rosaceous pollen, so plants in the rose family, the apples and cherries, most of the pollen in this study was coming from those plants. Our maples were pretty much done by that point, and here the willows hadn't picked up yet. So So just wanted to kind of emphasize this really cool work that's coming out of OSU. And if you look for Dr. Reed Johnson's papers, you'll read more about the work. They're actually studying soybean and how soybean pollen is used by bees and nectar. And here's a up close of those ash flowers, right? Not showy, they're not colorful. That's because they're not trying to attract any pollinators. They're just throwing all their pollen to the wind, just like oak catkins do. Okay, here's our hawthorns that Reed illuminated for us. And then our blueberries coming into bloom. Definitely some of our weeds are so important for honeybees, and sweet clover is, it's not a plant we want to grow on purpose. Somebody actually they called me a couple years ago and they wanted to grow a field of sweet clover, and we don't usually do that. It's hard to grow weeds on purpose. They're not easy to tame, and not usually that successful, but they can be a really important plant out there in nature. Then we're up to tulip tree, an amazing nectar source. Here's that tulip flower open wide. It's in the magnolia family, so similar structure to star magnolia that might be just done blooming for you, or saucer magnolia, the pink one that's about to start. So primarily a nectar, primarily a, I guess it's both pollen and nectar source. So another great nectar source are black locusts, but they're kind of unreliable for beekeepers. There'll be a great year where there's lots of nectar from black locust, and then another year not so much. So not a super reliable source from year to year. If we check back into the calendar, okay, so here's our black locust, and we see we're at about 467 growing degree day units, heat units that have accumulated. So one way you could use this calendar is every couple days, and you can punch it into your phone, or we don't have an app, but you can be on your Google on your phone, put in the GDD and OSU, kind of see where you fall. And let's say you're waiting for black locust. You really want to focus on that black locust nectar. And so you're using this as a target for when to make sure your honey supers are on, right? You're getting them on so the bees are bringing back that resource, have plenty of space to make that honey. Littleleaf Linden, another great nectar source. This is a non-native tree, but you may be more familiar with our native basswood, related to the Littleleaf Linden, but just really, really loved by honeybees. And you can smell these, it's a forest tree, really rich, sweet fragrance on this tree.